Good morning. I'm Harry Half. Thank you all for attending. And of course, special thanks to the Witte and the Center for Texas Studies at TCU, Maurice, Mary Margaret, Ron, and Michael. It's my pleasure to introduce your two speakers for the Art Marketplace of Texas, two people who, of course, need no introduction, but I get to do it anyway. J.P. Bryan has been collecting and involved with Texas art and Texas history his whole life. It's in his blood, as he's a lateral descendant of Stephen F. Austin. He began collecting when he was a boy, started a bookstore and dealt with Texana while in university, and in 1981 started Torch Energy, and over the next 32 years built a well-known Visions of the West collection, which was stunning. There's a book out, which many of y'all have probably seen. In 2013, JP purchased the old Galveston Orphans Home and fully restored it. In 2015, the Bryan Museum opened in the former orphanage. The Bryan Museum presents a chronological history of Texas and the American West with a special emphasis on the Spanish influences in the region, our region. The collection includes over 70,000 items in the fine and decorative arts: paintings, spurs, saddles, guns, maps, artifacts, books, and documents. And the museum has won numerous awards, both for the collection and for the historic renovation. And if anyone here hasn't been there at least 2 or 3 times, I'd say start planning a trip immediately after the talk. I mean, it is stunning. It's inspirational. And Kevin Vogel also has Texas art in his blood. His father, Donald, started the Valley House Gallery the year before Kevin was born in 1955. You're still young. And Kevin has worked at the gallery his entire career, becoming president in 1990 and curating numerous exhibitions and publishing catalogs on both modern, contemporary, and early Texas artists. The artists include Herman Lundquist and Richard Petrie, Kelly Fearing, Everett Spruce, William Lester, Ella Griffith, Josephine Aller Travis, Dorothy Austin, and Constance Forsythe. And Kevin and his wife Cheryl now run the gallery, but Kevin has told me that Cheryl is doing all the heavy lifting because he's more focused on an online platform, fineartsestate.com, which is part of the evolution of the Texas art marketplace. So Kevin, if you'd like to lead off. And we'll...
Thank you very much, Harry. It's great to be in San Antonio. Good morning, everybody. It is truly an honor to be asked to present to such an impressive gathering of scholars, collectors, and Texas art enthusiasts. To that end, I've written a short essay that sort of, I believe, summarizes everything. But on the way here in the Uber, it dawned on me that the title of the talk could completely sum up my entire talk, and if I just did that and sat down, I could probably set a record for the shortest talk ever given at a symposium like this. But unfortunately, I'm going to read the talk. The title of the talk is When Nobody Really Cared, and Then They Did. For the next 15 minutes, I will introduce you to several historic events that I believe laid the groundwork for how Texans were introduced to fine art from the late 19th century to the present day. I will also show how artwork produced by Texans played or did not play a role in these periods of enlightenment and discuss some of the institutional and private efforts to bring attention to Texas art and artists. And I forgot I had slides. At this point, I'm going to get controversial and reveal my definition of the word collector. I must say that I smile when a new person comes into the gallery, and when asked what their interests might be, they say proudly, "I now have 3 paintings in my collection." By using the dictionary definition of collector, that is, noun, a person who collects things of a specified type, professionally or as a hobby, or you believe that one and more than one of something forms a collection, then by those definitions, they are definitely a collector. But to an art dealer, the word collector takes on an entirely different meaning. To me, a true art collector is a person who has had to take a beloved artwork off the wall and put it in storage to make room for an artwork that is newly acquired. Those who have had to do this, I define as true collectors. Those who have never had to do it are decorating their walls. That is not to say that those who are decorating can't do it with exceptional artworks. It just means that they have not yet succumbed to the illness that is collecting, that ongoing heartbeat of, I can't live without it. By my definition of collecting, there were no true art collectors of contemporary Texas art in 19th century Texas. At least my research has not uncovered any. History paintings and portraits were commissioned, and paintings were purchased to hang over the fireplace, but there were no collections of contemporary Texas art as there are now. There were three major historic events that heightened public awareness of art in Texas: the Texas State Fair, Spindletop, and the Edgar B. Davis competitions. Once the fighting over the location and ownership of the Texas State Fair was settled and the city of Dallas got involved, one of the annual attractions generated by the fair was an exhibition of artworks by established American and European artists. In addition, there was often a competitive art show of Texas artists where ribbons were handed out, but these exhibits were on the same level as canning and biscuit making. Although the fair did not focus much attention on art produced by Texans, it did focus statewide attention on Dallas as a new area of heightened artistic consciousness, and may have been a factor in inspiring San Antonio artist Robert Onderdonk to move his family to Dallas in 1889. Robert Onderdonk was instrumental in forming the Dallas Art Students League, located at 721 Elm Street, where he taught one of the first formal art classes ever given in Dallas. The second event was the discovery of oil in Texas. With Texas's first major strike at Spindletop in 1901, the Texas art market started booming, and again, Texas artists were not the main beneficiary. Over the next 40 years, fortunes were made practically overnight, and many nouveau riche Texans wanted to acquire the trappings of wealth and good taste as quickly as they had become rich. And unfortunately, contemporary Texas art had no cachet whatsoever. The only art that would impress had to be European, primarily English or French. Disreputable art dealers flooded Texas and circled like vultures, selling many misattributed and fake artworks to naive and gullible Texans. In an article by Thomas Craven in the April 1938 issue of Scribner's Magazine, Craven rails about the brazen duplicity of both art dealers and the, quote, experts, unquote, of the day. Craven quotes Jean-Charles Millet just before serving a short sentence in jail for selling counterfeit paintings of his grandfather, the great French painter Jean-Francois Millet, quote, "Americans have made me rich. You can sell them anything if the price is high enough," unquote. In the article, Craven uses the now famous line, quote, "Corot painted 3,000 paintings, 18,000 of which are in America," unquote. The third major event was the Edgar B. Davis competitions, held annually for 3 years starting in 1927 and hosted by the Witte, just 1 year after completion of the building. I will not go into detail about this event as it would take far too long, but if you are not familiar with this amazing competition, I highly recommend you read Bill Reeves' book, Texas Art and the Wildcatter's Dream. What is most important about this event for the artists of Texas was not the amazing $52,000 in prize money offered over the Davis competition's 3-year run. It was the conditions under which the prize money was handed out. To give you, to place into context $52,000, that is a little over 1/3 of what it cost to build the Witte Museum the year before, essentially. When an artist won prize money in the Davis competition, that money was to be considered payment in full for the artwork, and the artwork would become the property of the person or entity that gave the money for the prize. Up until the Davis competition, there had been many organizations across Texas that had programs to promote their members through exhibition and sometimes honor them with prize money. But it was the purchase prize, first implemented in Texas by the Davis competition, that became the method of choice for how Texas museums, art associations, and art leagues put together their collections of Texas art over the next 35 years. After their experience in working with the Davis competition, the San Antonio Art League created an annual juried show in which they enriched their holdings of contemporary Texas San Antonio art by offering purchase prizes. They are the only active organization I know of continuing to use this strategy today. After the Davis competition, the Witte Memorial Museum named Eleanor Onderdonk, and this is Eleanor Onderdonk, isn't it, Harry? In theory. Okay, I was worried about that for some reason, but anyway, thank you.
It's a very attractive version.
Oh, got it. If you didn't hear it in the back row, he said, it's a very attractive version. Well, she was hired as curator in 1927, just in time to handle the logistics of the second Davis competition. Eleanor Onderdonk is most likely the first museum curator to fully understand the important artistic heritage left by 19th and early 20th century artists, perhaps because of her family's contribution to the development of a Texas art scene. Through her efforts, the Witte Museum was the first museum to actively collect historically significant Texas art. Through the local shows in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and Fort Worth, and the statewide extravaganza of the Texas General, each of these cities built their collections of local and regional art through the purchase prize. Although the city of Fort Worth was never a venue for the Texas General, they provided purchase prize money, and their museums benefited from acquiring some of the best available Texas artwork. The fact that the major Texas museums were supporting area and regional artists with annual exhibitions sent a message to the buying public. Texas art is okay. Art does not have to be imported to be worthy of museum acquisition. And then in 1961, a plague hit the Texas art market. It started when Houston hired a new director named James Johnson Sweeney. When I gave I mentioned Sweeney's name in a talk I gave at the Texas State Historical Association about 30 years ago, Cecilia Steinfeld was in the audience, and she audibly hissed out loud when I mentioned that name. Sweeney, most likely with a mandate from his board to take the Houston Museum from provincial to world class, immediately dropped the annual Houston Artists Exhibition, and although he continued to help fund the Texas General for 4 more years, he removed it from the museum schedule. The Texas General was a show that the Houston Museum created in 1940 and help the artists of Texas and acquire the best works that they produced. Over the next 4 years following Houston's lead, both Dallas and Fort Worth museums started to drop their local shows. It became clear that world-class museums did not have exhibitions of local artists on their schedule. This is also the time when each of these museums started hiring contemporary curators to guide their purchases of living artists. For the next 10 years, artists had to leave Texas and move to New York City to build their reputations before they would be invited back to show in a major museum, Texas museum. This trend started to change in the mid to late 1970s as more contemporary art galleries started to spring up in the major cities, and large corporations that were moving into Texas started to decorate their offices with local and regional artists' work. They realized that this was a good way of showing their new Texas clientele that they supported and wanted to be part of a new community. It was also at this time that true collecting started to come into its own, and artists of Texas started to benefit from this surge and interest in contemporary art overall. As far as Dallas dealers are concerned, possibly the first true contemporary art dealer was Joseph Sauter, who had a gallery in Dallas from 1926 to approximately 1976 on the 5400 block of McKinney. Sauter was a great proponent of the Dallas Regional Artist, and gave a show to William Lester in 1932, and according to Dr. Francine Carraro, was Bywater's exclusive agent. On page 45 of Carraro's book, Jerry Bywater's A Life in Art, Henry Nash Smith described the Sauter galleries as a, quote, modernistic, unquote, space with white walls and skylights designed by Alexander Hogue. Because Sauter dared to show work of young local artists and did not cater to the popular demand of paintings of fields of bluebonnets, the Dallas artists considered the gallery the most advanced in the city. There was very little interest in non-contemporary Texas art in Dallas until 1985, when the Dallas Museum of Art hosted Rick Stewart's seminal exhibition, Lone Star Regionalism. Before this exhibition, the only dealers I am aware of in the Dallas-Fort Worth area who were promoting the work of deceased or retired Texas artists were Madeline Williamson, William E. Johnson, Bill Burford, Ron Hall, and the Renonis. And most of these people, I think you could argue that Madeline Williamson was really the only person that was totally focused on early Texas art and nothing else. And the only true Dallas collector focused solely on early Texas art was Bill Cheek. Lone Star Regionalism traveled to 12 venues across Texas and Oklahoma, spawning a reevaluation of Texas art of all periods. With Stewart's show validating the idea that early Texas art had become worthy of collection, many of the first wave of would-be collectors it inspired were not overly knowledgeable about early Texas art. Since the least expensive way of getting involved was to purchase prints, they became the gateway drug for early Texas art collecting. Interestingly, most of these early enthusiasts generally generated lists of artists that were considered acceptable and started buying. It seemed to the dealers at the time that this frenzy of print buying was more about checking off a name on their list rather than developing the connoisseurship skills that would make their buying decisions sounder. As normally happens with any market, as the collector base expanded, the price of early Texas print started to escalate, and many of these collectors found that they could purchase a painting for not much more than a good quality Texas print. As the early Texas market heated up, it became obvious to several collectors that there needed to be an organization to share information, show off collections, educate, and raise awareness of early Texas art. Small organizations sprang up in the major Texas cities to serve this purpose, and in 2003, a statewide organization was formed called CASETA, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, the Center for the Advancement and Study of Early Texas Art. All these efforts have culminated in the fabulous exhibition that opens today here at the Witte. There are now many collections of privately owned, historically significant Texas art, and I hope that those who have created significant collections and will consider gifting them to institutions whose collections would benefit from their generosity. Remember, no matter how hard you try, thank you.
That was great. This business about talking about markets, art markets, is kind of like talking about the company budget or so forth. It doesn't bear the excitement of Michael Gower's opportunity to talk about Frank Ray. But anyway, I'll do my best to give you some of my reflections as a collector. When we talk about markets, art markets, remember, us collectors, we're looking at it from the other end of the telescope. We are this singular in our efforts, where we look out on this wide audience of dealers who obviously control or make the markets. All we bring to it is just an addiction for collecting. My wife, she says all the time, I do not understand how you can get any acknowledgement for shopping. If I look at Texas art, which I have, because I'm almost 80 years old now, so that's a pretty good viewing space or viewing shed I've had for some, let's say, 70 years of my life. What I see is a market in search of itself, and it seems to have been struggling along at that pace for quite some time. And so let me tell you about a few of my experiences or stories in dealing with the art market in Texas. So it probably, by the way, I began collecting when I was 10 years old. It was not art, it was a pistol. But, so I had an interest in collecting, and my father had a fabulous collection of Texas maps and rare documents, which he sold to the University of Texas. And my mother was not a collector. She was divorced 3 times, so she wasn't keeping anything around. But she had wonderful taste, and I know it's from her that I gained an appreciation for beauty and things proportionate. And let me just take a jab at minimalist and modern painting. I don't understand it. A dot on a canvas or minimal architecture, it is minimal, and it's minimal in terms of our ability to appreciate anything about it. I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and they had this new thing called Plan 2, and so I got in it, thanks to my dad. He was on the Board of Regents. I didn't have the intellect to do it, but I majored in art. And by the way, none of those teachers, if they did know anything about Texas art, sure never mentioned it. So I was not aware during the greatest period of my time at the university that there was anything redeeming or important in the Texas art world. And my first encounter, so to speak, with Texas artists came through a very strange occurrence. I had a partnership when I was in law school with a man named John Jenkins. And Johnny was truly a genius. And later in his life, he would become one of the great purveyors of Western Americana and Texas material in the United States by far. But Johnny and I had at this time on 910 Congress Avenue a small store. We sold rare books and coins. And we also started a small book publishing company called the Pemberton Press. And we published out-of-print rarities, which became a very reasonable business. And so we did a couple of notable things. By the way, we did the story about Frank Hamer, who shot Bonnie and Clyde, and there's a movie out now called The Highwayman. I recommend you watch it. It's very good. A lot of the factual information is taken from that book that Johnny and I published. But we weren't trying to get into law enforcement. We're just trying to make a little money. But what Johnny came to me with one day, he said, JP, I've got a chance to buy an art dealership here in town. I said, what's that? And he said, it's a country store gallery. So the deal was brought to us by a lawyer named Jerry, and I can't remember his last name, which is good because there's nothing good to say about Jerry. He had in tow a guy named Raymond Brown, and came to Johnny and said they needed some money to buy this store, which dealt in art, from a guy who I think his name was Dewey Bradford. So I helped put the money together. I got the money from Dorman David, who was married to my cousin. So Dorman David, Crook Jerry, Raymond Brown, Johnny Jenkins, and myself, we bought the country store gallery. Now, we were supposed to be selling art, but mainly we were making money just by the fact that we did a lot of framing of art that was brought to the store. And the only art that I recognized, name that I recognized whose work we sold, was a guy named Salinas. And he was a favorite artist of our president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And so I never thought that much of Lyndon Johnson's art critical talents. So I didn't think too much of our artist Salinas particularly. But that was my main exposure. There's a sad ending to all that. Johnny Jenkins ultimately committed suicide at age 60 because he knew he was about to be exposed for having sold forged and stolen documents. By the way, from him I bought the Declaration of Independence. Yes. And then Dorman David, who went to jail for having made the Declaration of Independence. Raymond Brown was quite successful, however, in marketing contemporary art by those who were painting the West, not as they had seen it, but as they imagined it. But they were very capable, and he did get some very good clientele with people like those owners in the King Ranch. But because of the impossibility of, or the difficulty, I should say, of dealing, I ended up selling my interest. And I did have a close personal connection with an art dealer in Houston named Meredith Long. And Meredith is still functioning, even though he's older than me by a number of years. But I first met him when I was in college, and he encouraged me to buy Texas artists that he was representing. I had a lot of French artists and so forth, but he was especially engaged with very important, he said, young budding Texas artists. And they would be the likes of Dorothy Hood and a man by the name of Anzalone, Herb Brooks and John Cowan and the likes, and also David Addix. So he would, of course, sell French art and so forth, but he loved Texas artists and continued to support them throughout their careers, which is, of course, what we need in the Texas marketplace is we need dealers that will support these young, aspiring artists. And I realized that through my connections with Meredith Long. Also, at the same time, about 1979, John Conley, our former governor, decided that he was a pretty good art critic himself. So they started a Night of the Artist type event, where they would sell quarter horses and art. Sometimes you'd get confused in the bidding and find out you were bidding on steel dust or something like that, rather than Melvin Warren's Crossing the River. But anyway, what they did amongst this suddenly expanding community that had been sponsored by rising oil prices in '79 with the Arab oil embargo, a new interest by buyers, because there was this new wealth that was flowing into the marketplace, and they were going after contemporary art. So if you want to know where G. Harvey and Melvin Warren, where they got their beginnings, it was through those events that Conley was sponsoring. And that, of course, led to that group of guys that live up there in Bosque County. And all of them are very capable artists. And it's very similar to the same thing that's being done by the Briscoe now, which is a wonderful event because it encouraged current artists to come show their wares. I understand that they made more than $2 million out of what had been just sort of a barely functioning event like 20 years or 15 years ago. And now, of course, we have Heritage Auction that is providing an annual venue for the sale of Texas art, plus many new dealers that are now starting to deal it. So we see an ever-expanding market. I didn't start buying Texas art until about the mid-'80s. Some of you in this room will remember. But in 1982, the economy in Texas crashed. And I'm amazed by how little is said about that, especially in the kind of economic calamities we seem to be going through in the country today. But nobody paid any attention to it. But every major bank in Texas, except for the Frost National Bank, went broke. The savings and loan business went out of business completely. Family fortunes were lost. You couldn't give away a drilling rig, much less be able to go out and even drill one, a well. This was a disaster. There was 10 million square feet of Class A office space available in downtown Houston, Texas. And for 10 years, there was no construction in that city, any major construction. Also, what happened? Regional art went down dramatically. So that's when I thought, as a collector, maybe there's something about this Texas art market that I ought to know about. Not knowing that there was anything necessarily out there to collect. Now, I'd heard about some guy named Bill Hill, or through him, he was a picker at the time, and he was my wife. My wife used to go out and they were buying stuff and that they thought was nice. And then somebody talked about a guy named Larry Sharon who was buying art by a fellow named Honordon. So anyway, I started studying the subject, and I was shocked and amazed. I said, my God, there is this whole proliferation of incredibly capable artists that call Texas home. And they painted in every possible medium and on every subject, and the brilliance of their product was overwhelming. So fortunately for me, I was able to get into that marketplace early on. So much so that I'm a collector, I'm an addicted collector. I slipped in the house with paintings well after dark so that my wife wouldn't know about it. And she decorated our home in a very sort of French motif or style. And one day she came up with her hands on her hips and she said, JP, we have a problem here. I said, what's that, honey? She said, it's all this stuff you keep bringing in the house and putting it in every corner. We don't have a wall left for it. And she said, none of it matches my taste at all. So one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm leaving or this art's leaving. Well, that was a real dilemma. So I solved it by a modest stroke of luck, and not genius certainly, but our company was starting to expand, and we had a lot of wall space and nothing on it. So I thought, I'll take all this stuff down to the office. So I did. And as you heard mentioned that, people in Texas, business people, begin to put things on their wall representative of the history and the art of Texas. So we did, and I did. And suddenly people started coming to our office, not to see me, but to see the art. And then we started bringing school children, and we began to realize how we could teach history. Because, listen, if you take, which we did frequently, a group of school kids, especially out of public school, and you ask them, what do you think of history? Boring will be their immediate response. So we have tried to engage them in understanding through the visual display of art and artifacts that history is high adventure. And what we have in the art of Texas, as the Western population was beginning to develop and influence was moving from the East Coast, suddenly we had the likes of the ARPAs and the Honordonks and others who came to the West and saw it. And they, as the population, as the importance, as the influence of the East Coast began to wane, suddenly we had a new culture developing. And also, what did we have? We had a new form of art. People started painting the West. And these people that you see their work on display here today, many of these saw it for the first time. Frank Ray lamented the fact that we would never see this place like he saw it. And that is so true. When we look at that art, we can see how special it is. We can see the beauty and the brilliance in what these people created. And it is a fabulous gift to us that they went out and told us about themselves and about what they saw in this world in which we now live today. So I think all of us have a sacred charge to keep, to make sure that this wonderful body of work is perpetuated and its importance understood by future generations of Texans. And let me tell you what's under attack, and you all need to take full measure of it. It's the importance of the history of this state. Who wants to collect stuff about history that has no importance or significance to you? There will be a very small body of collectors who will have any interest in the stuff that we all see on display. And by the way, this Witte Museum, and I know something about museums, I want to tell you, it is fabulous. The way they've displayed it's so educational, and it really should inspire children. But also, guess what? It also should inspire every one of you here today. And thank you. Now, I do have a few, if you have a minute more, I do have a few things to show you from the collection. And I'll try to tell you the reason why I picked these particular items, because I tried to get pieces of art. How does this, oh, here we go. There we go. So, guess what? We had art in Texas before 250 years ago. And this is the art of, this is Indian, Native American art, paintings on the Devil's River, and probably date about 11,000 BC. And it's interesting to me how forever we have wanted to express things through art. The earliest inhabitants of this planet seem to be so inclined also. And when people argue about, I wonder when people first roamed the world or this planet, I'd say, find me the earliest art form you can, and that's when it started. Because every human seems to want to express themselves through art, either by painting it or by appreciating it. That's just more of the same. They pecked into the surface, the stone surface, or they painted on it. So this happens to be on our ranch. And when people ask about, well, what do you think would be the most valuable piece of art? What price would it go for? Well, to get that one, you're going to have to buy the entire ranch. And of course, we had some fabulous Spanish art. This is the Mater de la Rosa. It was bought from a family here in San Antonio. It's obviously the Christ mother with the proverbial sword piercing her heart. This is painted on a 40-pound piece of copper. It is, in my opinion, I say this, and of course the curator and everybody raised their eyes, I say it's our Mona Lisa. But I truly believe it is. If you come to our museum and look at that painting, you will be stunned by the quality of the workmanship. That's another, and this is me after a day at work. No, that's Jose Arpa. And, you know, we talk about who, we all think about it, don't say it a lot, but who do we really want to give recognition to as the best artist that ever called Texas home? It would be hard to say that he wouldn't be at the top of the list. I mean, he could paint anything, a boat, a person, a scene, a great visual. The man was incredibly gifted. Now, I put this honor dock in here because obviously you can see the hand of William Merritt Chase on his shoulder here. And I don't think I've ever seen an impressionist painting by Julian Honordock that is more impressionist than this one. As you can see, it's the San Antonio River, and just a beautifully done work. And this is Dad. Robert. This is, many of you will recognize, this is San Antonio. I love the action in that picture. I will tell all of you in this audience today that I think Robert Onderdonk was a far greater artist than his son. Julian was just smart enough to figure out that there was a real market for bluebonnets. And once he got onto that one, his career went up like a rocket. And you really wonder, gosh, what if he had lived another 20 years, what could he have done? Well, maybe he'd assumed another name like he did with Turner and go out and paint 300 paintings. I don't know. But just to add emphasis to what I said about Dad, this is a still life that Dad did, a watermelon. There's an art dealer, he sold me the paintings, this is why he said it. He said it's one of the finest still lifes, one of the 10 best still lifes in America. And I called him back, I said, I bought that painting, you said it was one of the 10 best still lifes in Texas. That was the way the thing was written up. I'd already bought it. I said, where'd you get that from? He said, oh, I just put it in there. So beware of dealers. So this is just in there to wake you up. No, I've always admired Tom Lee's work. He has, as so many people do that are artists, they need patrons or real believers in their work. And Adair Margot, who lives in El Paso, started the Tom Lee Institute, has done everything in her power to perpetuate his reputation. Tom Lee painted every person first nude, and then he would begin to put the clothes on them. Now, I know, because I've done a lot of research on Tom Lee, that he had a real fondness for ladies. He painted a nude in his mother's bathroom when he was 15 years old. She was redheaded, and he said, I painted her red everywhere she had hair. So anyway, I bought this painting. Obviously, it was never meant to be sold, but I think it's wonderful because Tom Lee could really get your character on the canvas. So you can see this is his wife, and we have the painting of her fully clothed. But just so all of you would, have you ever wondered what she looked like without that dress? Well, there you go. Oh, now I didn't see anything, and maybe, excuse me if I missed it, but Elizabeth Ney is one of the most incredible, gifted artists to ever call Texas home. This is a medallion she did, and it's opaque. I didn't realize it until we put it on a little stand, and the sun came up, and you can see through it. And I then understood that she intended it to be that way. But what a brilliant artist she was. You know, she came to Texas because they wouldn't let her do men nude. And she said she was coming to Texas to sculpt the wild men of the West. And she did a good job of it. And there it is when it's on his stand, and if you had the sunlight behind it, you would see it. I love this. This is one of my absolute favorite paintings in the entire museum. And it's a tribute to all of those that came with the German and Alsatian immigration into Texas. It's a little Comanche girl eating a slice of a watermelon. And what's wonderful about all those artists is they painted the country and the people as they were. So there's such wonderful renditions historically of what people and would look like. And oh my gosh, this is Susanna Kithier. Look at the poignance and the softness on that face. It's just an absolutely spectacular work by Petrie, who was an extremely gifted and well-trained artist, probably one of the best that ever came to Texas. And that's Lundquist, Fall of Perdonalis. And this is a wonderful work by Thomas Allen. This is the first painting he did when he came to Texas. It's of Galveston Bay. And I want to call your attention to the subject because we had a conversation yesterday about when they were talking about Impressionist paintings, about the depiction of blacks and so forth. If you look at the children, they're black children, and this would have been in the 1870s, so very unusual for an artist to make them featured in the works at that time. And I think this, if you ask Frank Ray, I heard Michael Gower said he said this was his favorite work and so forth, when he wasn't even in Texas, painting that painting up on the Platte River. The Platte River is where the cowboys, when they crossed the Platte, they loved the Platte. The Platte, they said, was a mile wide and an inch deep. That's like a lot of people I know, but anyway. To me, and it's not because I'm fortunate enough to own it, because look, we don't own this stuff, we're just stewards of it. We just have the pleasure of having it in our presence for a while. This epitomizes Frank Ray. There it is, longhorn steer, long view, Paladura Canyon, looking at the west, that endless view. And there's Lippin Flats, another, and you can see the cows suddenly see something coming. It's over there in the distance. And this is by Stockfeld, who was undoubtedly the greatest maritime artist ever in Texas. And this painting of the SS Berlin is fabulous. And then finish here with these. This is Dawson Watson. These are all of his images, the 5 missions in San Antonio. And it really shows an impressionist influence on him that's expressed even in those 5 mission buildings. Thank you.
That's all right. I'll actually have to talk loud, which is hard. So we either can chat a little bit, or if y'all would like to ask a couple of questions specifically, up to y'all. Okay. That's okay. I was going to say we can start off with a couple of questions, or we can have them bounce around some topics like connoisseurship and education, how that works with developing marketplaces. So up to y'all. We all love listening to you. That's not true. But if you want to go ahead, you can grab a couple questions then.
Thank you.
So questions?
How has the internet changed the art marketplace?
Well, is this thing
It's not on. No. Here. There.
Hello? It's provided a service to people that just simply just want to collect something because they've driven down the price of all the more common things. But obviously, the better items have, gained geometrically in value. And the other thing, it makes them so much easier to shop. You can just go online and find almost anything these days. We're awash in information, but unfortunately we're not gaining any more wisdom along with it, which is the sad part.
I'd actually like to address that too, because what we used to do when you started collecting JP, Kevin, when you were raised with it, I said I'd never buy a painting if I couldn't look at it in person, because how can you trust anything but your eye? But because of the way the marketplace has changed everything on the internet, people make immediate decisions, and I think that actually there's some positive things, but what it does for training your eye in connoisseurship, I don't think it's helped that much. But it's the new world, so you go with it. But I'd say, the goal always was to keep training your eye. I mean, that's why you're a collector, JP. That's why all the great collections that we think about, it's because somebody had a passion and they kept working with their eye and knew it was a long process. It wasn't going to be something you'd pick up in 1 week over the internet.
I've got to respond to that. Everybody, you will hear it said about a collector by a dealer mostly. Oh, he or she, they have a great eye because you've got some good stuff around. That implies that, well, he doesn't know or they don't know much about the subject. They're just fortunate enough to have an eye for something that looks good. But the truth of the matter is you're never going to be a successful collector if you don't know as much about what you're buying as the person selling. And I will also say there are collections in this world, fabulous collections, but they're not put together by collectors. Collectors have a whole different connection to their collection. And these are innate objects, and they can't love you, but they can evoke emotion. And there may not be exact reciprocity, but I'll tell you, if you are a collector of a certain subject, and you'll have an affection for it, a love for it, and it'll stir emotions in you. And they can take away everything I've got. Just don't take my books.
Other questions?
JP, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody for starting the Bryan Museum, and anybody in this room who's not been there needs to go there. But I was fascinated when you were just opening it. We had a chance to tour the story about the difficulty in finding the right building and how the wonderful building you're in you almost didn't get. Could you give us a little bit of that background?
Well, quickly, we were trying to find a place in Houston in the museum district when we finally had decided to open a museum. We went through all the iterations, like sell the collection, give it to a museum, put it in a wing. I'd seen how that happens, and I didn't think the outcome would be good. So we went to Galveston. We're researching a book I'm about to finish. I started 30 years ago. But anyway, we're leaving the Rosenberg Library, and we went past the Customs House, and beautiful building built in 1861. It was for sale. So we stopped and looked at it and said, wow, what a beautiful building. And on the way back to Houston, the conversation turned to, well, wouldn't that be a great place for our museum? So we offered a contract. Turned out we couldn't buy the building because there had been 5.5 feet of water on the ground floor during Ike. So we couldn't use that for display or anything of importance. It only had 2 floors. So we were headed back to Houston, and our curator called and said, wait a minute, before you leave Galveston, go down 21st Street because there's this big house. It's pretty creepy looking, but you might just want to look at it. So we drove up in this big building. It was pretty creepy looking. It looked like, Edgar Allan Poe's kind of a depiction. But so had for sale sign. We called the realtor. She said, I'm back in League City. It's hot as hell out there, and I'm not coming back to Galveston. So I said, well, I think I know who the owner of this building may be. I'll call him and tell him you can't make it. And she said, I'll be there in just a few minutes. So we walked in, and you've all heard that expression, love at first sight. Honestly, I've never had that in my human experiences, but we walked in that building, and it was instantaneous. There wasn't any doubt we didn't need to look any further. It was we thought, for our collection, the perfect venue, and it turned out to be such. Well, it was an orphanage, by the way. So it has the history that we have, and then it has its own history about its functioning as an orphanage, beginning in 1894 until 1984, almost 100 years.
Aren't you concerned about future storms?
No, I'm not. That's what everybody asks, but the walls are 26 inches thick, solid brick. The roof was destroyed during the 1900 storm, but it was replaced with a very strong roof with 30-foot long cypress boards, 2 7/8 inches thick and 1.5 feet apart. And so if that building goes, the whole town of Galveston is going to be gone, and it's a big part of Houston. And so I'll just take the insurance check and go to Europe.
What's the elevation?
Matter of fact, in Ike, we got no water in the building. So it's about 18 feet above sea level.
I just want to ask you all a quick question. Thank you for what you all have done, not only yourselves, but also your families for Texas history and Texas art. But all three of you are great raconteurs. I want to know from all three of you the one that got away.
All of mine that got away went to JP.
Actually, the best story, the gentleman who told me this story is actually here today, and he told me a story about Otis Dozier, and to me it's the absolute classic tearjerker for a collector. I have never heard a worse story than this, and that was that he called Dozier up and said, "Mr. Dozier, I really like your art, and I'd really like to own one of your pieces. Would it be okay if I come by and visit?" And Otis, being a very congenial fellow, to most people anyway, said, "Sure." And so he went by, and he was being shown work that Otis had been doing just presently, that it was all new work. And he said, "Well, Mr. Dozier, I think you're a fabulous painter. I love what you're doing now, but my collection really is not of this period. It's really of earlier work. Like, I'm interested in what you might have done in the 30s or 40s, possibly." And Otis said, meanwhile, Velma had been watching, his wife had been watching what was going on, and she had left. She was in a wheelchair, and she rolled out of the room. And that's when this discussion occurred. And Otis said, "Well, you know, I have one painting in the closet that I'm not really very keen on." And he said, "Well, I'd love to see it if it's okay." So he brings it out and sets it on the easel, and I know what happened. I know the sweat broke out on his forehead, and he started going, "Well, so you're really interested in selling this one?" He says, "Yes, I am." So he said, "Okay, how much would you like for it, Mr. Dozier?" And he told him, and he pulled his checkbook out, and he wrote the check, signed it, ripped it out of the checkbook, and handed it to Otis Dozier, and Otis Dozier took it in his hand, and Velma rolled in. And Velma said, "Otis, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, Velma, this nice gentleman has just acquired this painting." "Oh, Otis, that's my favorite painting. How could you sell my favorite painting?" And Otis very sheepishly handed the check back, and I know that if it was not this man, he would have said, "I'm sorry, the deal's done," and walked away. But this is too wonderful a gentleman to have said that, and basically took the check back, thanked him, and left. And that painting was the Cotton Bowls painting that's in of Otis Dozier that's in the show here.
Great story. Well, I actually have two. The first was in August 1966. My dad called me and said, "JP, I have some news." I was living in New York at the time. He said, "I have some news for you." Said, "Your mom and I are getting a divorce, and I just sold the entire collection of maps and books to the University of Texas," which, of course, I thought were going to be mine. I was devastated by the news of the sale. And that's when I started collecting. I tell people, they say, "When did you start getting all this stuff?" I said, "Really, August 1966. Sometimes they'll say, "Why do you know the date?" And that's why. The other, this is so painful I can barely talk about this one. So we had a fabulous collection after we moved everything down to our company, Torch Energy. And Torch was doing quite well, and I encouraged the company that was our major investor to buy Texas art. So they agreed to it, and we started buying it in the name of Torch Energy. Over time, I ended up owning half of Torch Energy and with some other partners. And they decided to buy my interest in Torch. And they said, well, we need to sell the collection. And this is the only thing I've ever sold that I can remember. I agreed to the sale of that entire collection. And John now has it right now. And I can't bear to go in his office and look at it. But he's a wonderful man, and it's, I'm happy for him to have the collection, but it's the greatest mistake I ever made as a collector. I could have just gone ahead and told my partners, look, I own half of it already, I'll just pay you for the other half, and kept it. But I didn't, and I've lived to regret it.
What that brought to mind, the first story, is something that I actually alluded to a little bit in my last paragraph of my essay. People come into the gallery and they say, we're now downsizing, our kids are going off to college, can you help us sell off some of these artworks that we have? And my first question, being a very stupid dealer, my first question is always, have you asked your children if they're interested in the art you're about to sell? And very, very rarely does that person say, oh yes, we had a long conversation with them and they've decided they don't want any of it. And I've spoken to children who have lost artworks that they had walked by every day when they went to dinner or something and stopped and looked at them because they were of such great interest to them, and then come home one day and find out that the parent has sold them. And so what I'm going to urge you all to do is, before you sell anything, it's all going to the museums anyway, but before you sell anything, would you at least ask your children if there's something there that they really would like to have or would want, it would mean something to them to own it?
Which is a nice way to end, which is to say art's always emotional. Anyway, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, JP. Thank y'all.